Today we're going to talk about Philip II of Macedonia and his son Alexander the Great and their relationship with the Greeks of the south, the Greeks of the big city-states like Athens and Thebes and Corinth and Sparta, the political entities that had dominated Greek politics for so long until Philip II really rewrote all the rules and changed the balance of power in Greece itself. Now, this is in answer to a question that was raised with one of the comments on, I think, the video about cataphracts and their frequency and use amongst the Persians and the Romans at various times. The question was really to do with, well, was Alexander fundamentally different in the way he interacted with the Greek states, the way he thought about them? And particularly, obviously, the one thing that Alexander did was to besiege and capture and then sack the city of Thebes and destroy it as a political entity, although that did not prove to be permanent, but nobody knew that at the time. Now, obviously, Philip II never did anything quite like that. He never takes on a state as large as Thebes and destroys it. He does capture and absorb and in some cases effectively end some of the smaller city-states up in and around Macedonia and its borders and that area, depending on how you define Macedonia, in that contested area in northeastern Greece, along the coast there, running around the Chalcidius, running up to the Bosporus, all that area. As he expands the Macedonian kingdom and his control, he will confront lots of Greek states, places like Olynthus and Potidaia and others that are not famous in the same way. They were never as large, never as important, never as wealthy. They were, in the main, colonies, offshoots of other southern Greek states that had been fighting over the resources of that area for quite a long time. Obviously, these are places that had figured in the Peloponnesian War and in power struggles before that. So Philip did fight against the Greeks and obviously won the Battle of Chaeronea, that big victory against a coalition based around the Thebans and the Athenians, but also including many other southern Greek city-states, although, of course, again, we have to remember there were lots of Greeks fighting on Philip's side as well in that encounter, so it isn't as simple as Greeks fighting for independence against the Macedonian threat. From some perspectives, that's what it was all about, from others, less so. So we can certainly say that based on their record, Alexander was more confrontational, more brutal in his dealings with the Greek city-states, Thebes being the proof of that. So, on the one sense, the question asked, yes, it is true in that respect, that Alexander was more aggressive, did things that Philip had never done. Whether or not there were circumstances in which Philip might have done similar things is a more difficult question. It's one of the what-ifs of history. We don't know. He didn't do it, therefore there is a clear difference between his behaviour and the conduct of his son, Alexander the Great. But I think the main question actually about all this is really to try and explain why each of them acted in that way, how their behaviour was shaped by the circumstances of their individual reigns. Because, to jump to the end, we have to remember that Alexander didn't spend much time in Greece. He becomes king and within a very short time leads the expedition off to Asia Minor, off into Persia, off to India, never returned home to Greece. He dies before he can do that. So Alexander's relationship with the Greek city-states in the main was conducted at a distance. It was conducted from the camp of his army, wherever it was, whether it was in Syria or Persia or Afghanistan or India, any of these places as he went along. It was conducted by letter, it was conducted by envoys from each side. He is not dealing with them in the same way as Philip. There's only a brief period at the start of his reign where he was physically present in Greece, in the area, and able to intervene, able to interact with them at a much more immediate level, much quicker as well. Obviously, it takes a very long time for messages to reach the Macedonian army and get to Alexander if he's all the way over in what's now northern Pakistan, compared to if he's up there in Pella or Amphipolis or any of these places in the north. So that's something to remember. And that then makes us realise that Philip's circumstances are, of course, fundamentally different to those of his son. Philip inherits the kingdom of Macedonia, is proclaimed as king because one of his brothers has just died fighting the Illyrians. the older brother again had been murdered by an internal conspiracy. Macedonia, when Philip was growing up, when he was young, when he becomes king, is a much, much weaker place than it would be by the end of his reign, because that's the mark of his career. So Philip was someone who grew up in a world where the Greek states were more powerful, more obviously interventionist within Macedonia, and frequently so. Macedonia, as I mentioned before, it's the reason why those colonies are there, why the cities develop along the coast, has a lot of things that people in southern Greece want. It's got mineral resources, it's got timber, it's got good agricultural land. So it has lots of things. It also, those cities along the coast, they're part of that link that's controlling the trade routes through the Bosporus into the Black Sea, where, again, a lot of grain is coming that in particular Athens has depended on for a very long time. Athens could grow into such a huge city-state and have such a large population, and of course famously survive the Spartan invasions early on in the Peloponnesian War by relying on grain and food that was imported from elsewhere, and much of it coming along that route. So Macedonia has always been an area of rich pickings for other powers, other leaders, other states, including those of southern Greece. And when Philip becomes king, it's at a particularly low ebb of its power after this big defeat against the Illyrians, the death of the king and a substantial part of his army. Even before that, there have been interventions which has meant that Philip has spent part of his teenage years in Thebes as hostage is never quite the right word, but he is there as surety for a treaty, for peaceful and suitably submissive behaviour on the part of the Macedonians in relation to the Thebans and their interest. So he spent several years in the household of a Theban aristocrat, at the social functions, the dinner parties, at the gymnasium, out hunting, doing all the things that Greek aristocrats do, but getting a sense of that political life, because very much so, and in particular the individuals involved, these are people who live and breathe politics on a day-to-day basis, both the internal politics of the city-state, but also the wider interrelation and interaction between all the other neighbouring city-states, the ones further beyond, and that sense of a wider world and the different powers within it. So Philip grows up at a time of Macedonian vulnerability. He grows up partly as a captive, a hostage, whatever you want to call it, of a Greek city-state that at that moment, in those brief years, was the dominant military power in southern Greece. This is the time when the Thebans have defeated the Spartans at Leuctra, when Epaminondas has won his victories, has dominated, when they're encouraging the Helots and allowing them to break away from Sparta, fundamentally weakening the Spartan system. So he's been at the centre of the political life, or he's at least been able to witness it, of the great power in southern Greece at that time, although nothing ever lasts very long within the politics between the city-states, because there's always this constant reassertion of power, of status, of relationships with each other. They keep on trying it by threats, by aggressive diplomacy, ultimately by raiding, perhaps full-scale war, to find out, are you really as strong? How do we have to treat you? Do we need to respect you? Do we need to obey you? So Philip has had direct experience. He has witnessed that sort of political life, that sort of diplomatic life, even that sort of military activity going on. He's seen much more of the life of the Greek city-states than Alexander ever would, because Alexander is never a hostage, and he may visit Athens once in his lifetime during the negotiations, late in his father's reign. He spends some time in Epirus, but Epirus is again rather like Macedonia. It's on the fringes of what at least southern Greeks consider to be the properly Greek world. It's not the same thing as living in Thebes. Alexander never lives among members of the city-states in the same way that his father had. So that's one thing. Philip is born into a different world. He then, as king, had to operate in a fundamentally different world to the one when Alexander inherits the kingdom. Because Macedonia is weak, and Philip faces a whole range of threats from Illyrians, from Thracians, and particularly from pretenders within his own family, other Argeads who wish to be king. And because there's no clear law of succession, because pretty much anybody, if they get the backing, can make themselves monarch, then his half-brothers and other relatives are all threats. and the early years are dominated by struggles against these and the successive elimination of all the potential rivals. So Philip has to fight against lots of powers that begin as, at least on the surface, significantly stronger than him. And he has to piece together victory. First, in this case, beat off the Illyrians, defeat the challengers from his own family, move on. Start to challenge and then defeat, absorb the city-states that are on his borders, that have become independent, that are powerful, but whom he needs to dominate and whose resources and access to resources he wants. Philip is supposed to have boasted later in life that he was prouder of his diplomatic achievements than his military victories. Now, he spends most of his life on campaign. There are very few periods when he's sitting still, and often they appear to be when he's recovering from wounds. So he isn't in the Macedonian capital that much of the time. Most of each year he goes off and he campaigns. Now, a lot of these campaigns were fought against the Thracians, the Illyrians, the other tribal peoples, the non-Greek peoples beyond his northern borders. And these don't get the attention in our essentially Greek sources as much as they deserve. You know, there's nothing like the equivalent of Arrian's description of Alexander's initial campaigns in the same area before he heads off for the Eastern expedition that will culminate in the sack of Thebes, but nevertheless begin. The first real enemies are all these tribal peoples to the north. But we don't have anything like that for Philip. We get hints of he's here, he's doing this, he's campaigning against various groups. He'll push ever further during his reign. He'll reach up and start contacting Scythians and others beyond. So a lot of his time is spent there. A lot of his time is spent in warfare. There are also campaigns to the south. There's interventions in Thessaly, then further south than that, the Sacred War, all of these things. We haven't got time to go through it in detail. But Philip spends a lot of time on campaign. He does fight a lot of actions, sieges, surprise attacks, and occasional battles against Greek enemies, as well as non-Greek, barbarian, for want of a better term, tribal groups from beyond his borders. Although, again, we should remember that big battles are rare things, and they don't happen every year. You know, there are 3 or 4 in Philip's reign. There are about the same number that Alexander fights. Lots of the fighting is much smaller scale, and an awful lot of it surrounds walled strongholds. It's to do with either surprise attacks, raids outside, threats to persuade them to give in, or it's escalade, or it's even full-scale siege, which might take weeks or even months. So Philip is doing lots of this, but all the time he is also negotiating and talking. And he's doing this because he very much, at the beginning, can't just take on the world. He doesn't yet have. The Macedonian army that Philip starts to create is not the formidable military machine that it becomes and that Alexander inherits and then develops even further. It doesn't just spring into life. It takes time to develop, and a lot of its later success would come from the habit of victory that's acquired under Philip, but it's acquired by hard campaigning, good leadership, and good luck. So they get used to winning, but that takes time. At the start of his reign, they're used to losing. You know, Macedonians are not thought of as a great military power. It's Philip who will change that, Alexander who will confirm it forever. So Philip spends a lot of time campaigning, but even more in diplomacy, and there is constant talk of envoys going to him and of Macedonian envoys going to the cities. You have diplomacy amongst Greek city-states is too big a topic for us to deal with in this video. Maybe we'll come back to it at some point, but might not be for a while. Like most ancient states, you don't have permanent embassies and presences, but you do have traditions of guest friendship, for want of a better term. Particularly amongst the aristocratic, the wealthy families will have connections with similar people in other cities. And this is true of all the Greek states. So Macedonia has the people it knows, the people who are favourable to it. Philip will develop this. And just as it's said that he makes war like a merchant, he uses his profits of one victory to pay for the next campaign. Huge amounts of money are going as gifts to people. and bribes effectively. Whilst it's a constant of people like Demosthenes and other orators at Athens and elsewhere to say that everybody else is taking bribes apart from them, and that Philip's, anyone who speaks up for Philip must have taken Macedonian money. There is a degree of truth in it because of this sense of hospitality that goes back to the Homeric ideal of exchanging gifts, exchanging presents, lavishing your wealth to show how important and how well disposed you are on both sides. And Philip is certainly a very good manipulator of individuals and of political struggles within communities. Because again, while we might talk of Athens or Thebes or Corinth and talk of their policy, their attitudes, for the Greeks, you tended to talk of the Athenians, the Spartans, the Thebans, the Corinthians. The places are significant only because they are the center for a people. And the people are a political entity, and Greeks being Greeks, they're a political entity that spends a lot of its time arguing with itself. There are lots of different factions, lots of ambitious individuals and groups, all competing with each other. And time again, it's competition within a state that makes it vulnerable to rivals and enemies from outside. And you'll see this with Philip's successes. Philip will develop an extremely efficient and effective siege train to allow him to capture walled strongholds, walled cities. But also, like anyone else, and there is a long tradition of this in Greek warfare, the easiest way to get inside any walled stronghold was to have somebody open the back door and let you in. And if you could find a faction, individuals, men who are willing to get to power with your backing, then that was the quickest and cheapest and most reliable way of getting inside someone else's community. And then hopefully it allowed you to, perhaps dominate is too strong a word, but influence that community, because you've got what you could consider as your own men, or at least people favourably disposed to you, people who owe you, in charge there. And the other, of course, warning to them is that if they don't please you anymore, well, there might be somebody else willing to open the back door another time and let you in and overthrow the existing powers this time. So with Philip, his whole experience is gradual increase of his power, success, small successes first, then add another one, then add another one. Use the money from that to improve your position diplomatically, to improve your army, to consolidate your control of Macedonia, make the kingdom wealthier, give people land who will then owe you military service, to increase the army. All of these things are intertwined. Add on allied communities at every stage as well. So Philip has to work within this environment. He can't just afford to march south in Greece and tell everybody what to do and say, well, if you don't do it, I'll fight you in battle and win. He is not in that position. Even the Chaeronea campaign is remarkably cautious. There's quite a while before they actually fight the battle. And there is a hope in every case. It's often the pattern with these sorts of conflicts that both sides think the other will back down. And they keep thinking they can raise the stakes and raise the stakes and threaten, and eventually, yes, they'll back down, and you end up with a battle that probably neither of them really wanted and is much riskier. One of the things to remember, we're used to the fact that the Macedonians win all the key battles with the exception of one in the Sacred War under Philip, but that Alexander is never defeated in any serious pitched battle. We know that, people at the time didn't know it. And battles are rare because they are a big risk. Because although when you've got a good army you think you're probably going to win, if it goes wrong, if you lose badly, there's a great danger that not only will you suffer very serious losses to troops it might be hard to replace, but that their confidence goes and everybody else's fear of you also goes. So there's a tentative nature about it. So Philip is very much the diplomat as well as the commander, as well as the military leader, in a way that is less true of Alexander. The emphasis probably shifts. Alexander is still very, very happy in his campaigns if people will defect to him. If when he arrives they submit, they show suitable humility, they ask to be his friends, they give him what he wants, food, wealth, whatever it might be to help fund the campaign, and then submit, and probably soldiers as well. So Alexander will do this. To see Alexander as purely this sort of wild military leader who wants to hack his way through every problem is an exaggeration. But the emphasis that he places on warfare is probably, for him, it's the easier response for him to do. It's the more natural thing, whereas Philip probably goes first to diplomacy rather than war, but again, that's a reflection of capacity. Early on in his reign, Philip can't afford the risk, and he doesn't have the military might that he will develop slowly. It's also the Greek states are busy weakening themselves all the time, so that helps. So Philip's situation is different. The circumstances in which he inherits the kingdom are different, hence the fact his behaviour is different. Maybe that reflects personality as well, but then that comes down to the question of how far your personality is instinctive there at birth, how much it is shaped by the environment, the circumstances in which you have to work. Philip II is remarkably successful in doing what he does. He turns Macedonia around, he changes it from this vulnerable, fractured kingdom preyed on by its neighbours to the dominant military power in all of Greece and well beyond his northern borders, and a power that is in a position to launch a major expedition against Persia that his son will actually lead. So Philip's situation is different. Philip has to work for all this. Again, it would help if we had accounts of the same sort of detail as Plutarch and Arrian for Philip's life, because we could probably then see in rather more detail just how he develops the kingdom, the army, his diplomatic influence, and how the wars fit into all of this. Instead, we see the bare bones of it, and we're left to sort of piece it all together. And there are, say, one of the striking differences between Philip and Alexander, and notice this very much when writing the book, is that there are quite a few times in Philip's life where we don't actually know where he was at any one time. That's not true of Alexander. We pretty much always know, with a fair degree of margin of error, where Alexander was and how long he was there. So Philip has to be the diplomat as well as the soldier, because that's the situation where he's operating, and he's extremely good at it. And he also realizes that diplomacy can be cheaper than warfare. And in the Chaeronea campaign, every impression is that he would prefer not to have had to fight that battle, because if he could have achieved his dominance, his leadership of the main states like Athens and Sparta, and Thebes and these others in southern Greece. Sparta is, of course, staying out of this in that quintessentially odd way of their behaviour in the 4th century and to some extent before as well. Again, that's another bigger issue that maybe we'll come on to another day. Philip has to be more subtle. He has to be more careful, and he has a talent for it. The sources that speak of diplomatic visits to Philip's court emphasize very much the suaveness, the charm, perhaps the slippery nature of Philip. You can see all these things as both positive and negative. Philip was a shrewd political operator. He was the sort of man who could persuade you, who could give the impression that he was on your side because that's what he wanted to give at the time, and tended to be able to manipulate rather well. That's not emphasized anywhere near so much with Alexander. Alexander could make a huge impression on people, but he didn't have that subtlety of his father. But again, we come back to his situation. Alexander is only 18 when he becomes king. He has relatively little experience. Point one, compared to Philip, he doesn't know anywhere near as many Greek people in the same way. Yes, he's appeared, there's that supposed scandal where he's sung and played the lyre for visitors, which is thought of as a rather sort of dishonourable thing by Athenian standards for a young man to do, all a bit dodgy. But the Greeks don't know him. Lots of them know Philip or feel they know Philip, and certainly Philip clearly felt that he knew lots of the leading figures of major Greek states. Alexander is too young to have developed those sorts of relationships, and that works both ways. The Greeks do not know him. Chaeronea was a failure of Philip's diplomatic strategy in many respects, and that he had to fight this campaign and battle because the Thebans and the Athenians had managed to join together against him. And normally you could rely on Greek states not being willing to work together. There was always this trade-off in the way they thought of who is the biggest danger at this moment. So if Philip's the biggest danger, okay, I don't like the Thebans, but I'll join with them. On the other hand, if Thebes is the big danger, or from Theban perspective Athens is the big danger, then maybe you look to Macedonia and think, well, maybe useful having them as a friends while we deal deal with the people we really don't like at the moment. There is always that fluid nature of relationships between Greek city-states. So Alexander comes very new to this. He is an unknown quality. And that's the other thing that's all too easy to forget. We know what he's going to do. We know how great a commander he will prove. But he is just this kid. Yeah, he's charged, he's fought at Chaeronea, he's done all this sort of stuff, but he's still just Philip's boy. Philip, over 20 years, has proved himself to be a formidable opponent. A diplomat, a soldier, a general. Southern Greeks might not necessarily like him, but they had to respect his ability and fear his ability. And that was a factor they had to bring into any calculations as to how you should deal with him. Alexander is the unknown quantity. So when Philip is murdered, what is Alexander going to do? You're there in 336. What's going to happen? Has it changed? Bear in mind, Philip has only been around for a couple of decades. There are still plenty of people around, and all the main leaders of the important Greek city-states will be men who are old enough to remember Macedonia as an unimportant, almost impotent, fractured kingdom of semi-Greek barbarians up in the north. Only there to be plundered, only there for its resources, but not a serious threat or problem in its own right. Philip has changed all that. But has it changed because Philip is this genius? Again, you may not like him, but you have to respect him, who's fought so well, who's outwitted you, who's diplomatically outmaneuvered you, who's done all of these things, but he's gone, he is dead. And you have some kid who's taken over who hasn't really done much. So people are bound to be looking and thinking, well, okay, what's next? What's the relationship? Again, comes back to this constant reassessment of status all the time, this ongoing competition within Greek states, but also between Greek states, the sense of who is important, who is powerful, who is dangerous. Do I fear him? Do I fight him? Do I outwit him? Do I ignore him? All of these factors, all of these considerations change at every stage. They're constantly reassessed. And the removal of Philip from the equation is a major, major factor and leaves a lot of unknowns. So Greek states look at Alexander in a different way. Alexander, of course, has a different problem. An advance guard has already gone to Asia Minor to begin Philip's war. This clearly is something that is dear to Alexander's heart. On the one hand, he's got to prove himself to a Macedonian army and court and aristocracy that are Philip's men, that have grown wealthy, powerful, full of themselves, important, confident under Philip because of all the successes. Alexander has become king in the murky aftermath of his father's murder. There are rumours of his involvement. True or not, doesn't matter. People are at least willing to consider that, think it a reasonable possibility. And again, the Macedonians don't know if Philip has been reborn in Alexander, if there is somebody just as good. Because you've got used to a leader that you could trust to win. Because by and large, that's what he's done again and again and again. Yes, he's led from the front. Yes, he's been skillful. Yes, he's done all these things. But he's kept giving you victory. More than anything else, that's what you want if you go to war. You want victory, you want success for your kingdom. You want to stay wealthy, you want to stay powerful. If possible, you'd like to grow even more wealthy, even more powerful. Can Alexander deliver that? Again, we know yes, but they didn't. So Alexander has become king in these circumstances. He has to prove himself to the Macedonians, to the Greeks, but also probably to himself. Now, he wants to go on this big Asian war. Fighting Persia is the dream. It's the one thing he can do. If any of these stories from Plutarch about him being jealous of his father, resenting Philip's achievements, have any basis of fact, then Alexander needs the Persian expedition, because it's the thing that Philip never did. He started, he wasn't able to go himself, he wasn't able to develop to any serious degree because he's been murdered. He was about to do it. Everything is set up. Macedonia has been geared towards this. So the army, the economy, everything is set up to this moment. If Alexander says, well, no, we're not going, or we're not going for 5 years or 10 years, then his credibility is going to collapse quickly. But also his own desires, his own self-belief, to step out from the shadow of his father is a big task for Alexander. And even though he will do that, again, hasn't happened yet. and he is very, very young, and he has not yet filled the army with his contemporaries. Most of the senior commanders are very much Philip's men. They're all much older than Alexander. So Alexander has to stamp his authority on the Macedonian kingdom itself, but also on Greece. What he doesn't want to happen is that he marches off, takes the army to Asia Minor, maybe starts winning some victories, then Athens, Thebes, Corinth, maybe even Sparta this time as well. The big cities, lots of the lesser cities of southern Greece rebel against him. He can't leave enough troops behind to make Macedonia's position utterly secure militarily and still have enough to go and fight the Asian War. So part of this is what Philip's been manoeuvring for. It's what we call the League of Corinth, this agreement to lead the Greek states in a war of revenge against Persia, the war in which, of course, revenge for which when the Macedonians were actually on the Persian side for most of that conflict, but hey, we don't need to worry about those details. So you're taking lots of Greek contingents with you. That's one way of involving the Greeks in the expedition, but also taking away an important part of their military manpower. Hopefully some of the most aggressive and able soldiers go off with you to fight against the Persians rather than to rebel and fight against the Macedonians. So you have to see the campaign against Thebes in the context of Alexander not wanting to hang around in Greece longer than he has to, or in Macedonia. The Persian expedition is his priority. That's his dream. That's what he wants to do. And there is a danger that if it stagnates at this point, if he doesn't follow up, bear in mind as well, remember that during the course between Philip's death and Alexander going over in 334, most of the territory taken by the initial advance guard has been lost to the Persians again. So the initial progress has started to turn sour. If you let the Persians defeat that force completely, then how easy is it to begin again? Because the Persians know what you're thinking about, they're more likely to be ready for you this time. So Alexander needs to get going, and he wants to get going, and he wants to prove himself, and he wants to go off and do things that Philip never did. He can't risk the prospect of Greece erupting into opposition to Macedonia while he's away. Therefore, in Thebes, where the opposition to Alexander begins in rather, it's based on rumours of his death, of problems, of all this sort of thing, as these incidents often were. Alexander has to make a point at that stage. He doesn't have the time to do things the subtle Philip way. And maybe he doesn't have the connections to do that as well. Again, remember, Philip's diplomatic success came over decades, not just in a year, not just when he was young. He builds up gradually. Alexander could try and follow suit, but that's going to take a long time. So Alexander's brutal attack on Thebes is to prove that okay, Philip's dead, but the Macedonians are still the toughest military force around. You cannot face us and expect to win. He has to show everyone in southern Greece that opposing him is a seriously bad and probably terminal idea. So Alexander attacks Thebes, sacks the city, destroys it as a political entity. No one has done that to a community on the scale of Thebes for a very, very long time. Probably really never in Greek history. Thebes is big, it's important, it has been the dominant power just recently. Notably, the Spartans at the end of the Peloponnesian War do not dissolve Athens. They try to control its government, try to change it, remove the long walls, all that sort of thing connecting Athens to the Piraeus, but they don't destroy it. And Philip had held off repeatedly from any attempt to destroy Athens or Thebes. Athens in particular opposes him again and again and again, and he always treats them rather well and rather kindly. And the most probable thought, other than perhaps he just liked them, is that it would stain his reputation too much to destroy Athens, because Athens has a cultural reputation, which is unmatched by anybody, least of all Thebes. But also, what do you do if Athens goes, if Attica breaks up into small communities and city-states, if the Athenian fleet is no longer there? How does that destabilize everything else? Philip is always dealing with a sort of patchwork of things where you can't unravel one thread too far without sewing it up somewhere else. You've got to keep the thing together at the end. Alexander gambles on the fact that this will be such an appalling object lesson that destroying Thebes will mean that nobody rebels against him. And he's right. You know, it's a long time before the Greeks start doing this. Whatever Demosthenes might say, whatever he might, however excited he might get when rumours come that Alexander's lost at the Battle of Issus, all this sort of thing, nevertheless, there is no serious move for a long time. And later it will be the Spartans who go their own way, as they so often do, and fail. And it won't be until after Alexander's death that the other major powers of Greece begin to come together against the Macedonians. And even then, it doesn't go that well. So you can look at it from the view of results, and clearly the destruction of Thebes terrifies everyone to the extent that Alexander needed it to do. He is able, by 334, to go off, invade Asia Minor, march on into Persia, Egypt, Pakistan eventually, and never look back, and deal with them from a distance. So, yes, coming back to the original point, the behaviour of Alexander is different to that of Philip, but it's probably far less to do with temperament, personality, all this sort of thing, personal inclinations. It is much more to do with the situation each man finds himself in at the start of his reign and throughout. Philip is doing something different and then learns a different method of dealing with the Greeks, but also, again, it comes back to relationships. He gets to know how these cities tick, how their leading people tick, and so do those leaders get a sense of, okay, this is Philip, this is how far we can push him, this is how far we need to placate him. You know, how do we deal with him? How do we factor him into our domestic politics, to our relationships with other nearer city-states, so that it comes out in our best interest? They don't have that relationship with Alexander. He doesn't have it with them. He doesn't have time to create it. And so you have the brutality of the sack of Thebes, and that sense that, again, you could say this is Alexander the youth, Alexander the impatient, Alexander the aggressive, and it is all of those things, but it's also, in a very brutal, practical sense, this is Alexander achieving what he needs. So I would say it's more to do with the circumstances, the situation, than it is a temperamental thing. However, it's, you know, you can never imagine Alexander the Great boasting that he was prouder of diplomatic achievements than military. The military is always emphasized and will be subsequently. So there are parts of that as well, but that's what I would see as the importance of the story, is less the event itself, though that clearly matters, but also understanding why it happens, why they did these things. And that's the big distinction. Now, to go and look, as I think the original question raised, into these successes and what happens afterwards, that's just too big a question. Maybe another day, but we'll see. Their relations with the Greek states will change, and if you go onto that, you're then looking at, well, how do the Romans deal with them as well, and this sort of thing. So it's a big issue, and maybe one day, but we'll see. But for today, that's all really I've got to say on this theme for the moment. I suppose I can't avoid the inevitable author thing. There's much more in the Philip and Alexander book. All of this is dealt with in more detail, and it does help to know the narrative, to know the timings of everything. And but for the moment, we'll call it a day, particularly as I think one of the cats is starting to yell in the background. So before they make their appearance and demand attention, we'll stop this video.